Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History, U.S. History Edition. Today we're going to continue looking at the Great Depression. So we're going to build a little bit off of what we learned about last time, certainly with this switch in leadership. So in the picture, certainly we are looking at the man who will be elected president in 1932 and start in 1933, that being Franklin Delano Roosevelt, more commonly known as FDR. We'll talk a little bit about why Americans decide to elect him and that what FDR wants to do once he becomes president, and in particular, something that today we call the New Deal. So let's look at this first learning objective. We're going to be able to identify how FDR essentially promises this, quote, New Deal, this new approach to getting the United States or getting America out of the Great Depression. And when we kind of start with FDR certainly, he's a wealthy Democrat from New York. And he's going to have some experience before he becomes president as governor of New York. He's actually going to get reelected in 1930, the governor of New York. And you're going to see that he's got an eye for reform, for change. More to come on that in a little bit, though. He is a distant cousin of the former president Teddy Roosevelt. In fact, he is going to marry a relative of Teddy Roosevelt as well. But he's going to decide to run for president against Hoover in the election of 1932. Now, you might recall from last time, Hoover does make a change where he was kind of a little bit hands-off at the beginning after the stock market crash and then started to involve the government a little bit more in the latter years of his presidency. But you're going to see that people are going to want to shift. People are going to want to change. And that's where FDR comes in. FDR has a very important partner. And he's going to end up marrying a woman by the name of Eleanor Roosevelt. And yes, that is her maiden name. They are distantly related. I believe they are fifth cousins. But one of the things that FDR is attracted to first with Eleanor is that she, again, I believe she's pretty closely related to Teddy. And so that is something that he wants to become president and he wants to marry Eleanor. Those are kind of two things that he wants to do. And I'm not going to get a lot into their marriage in this particular setting, but they do have more of a partnership than certainly a marriage. And they do make each other better, but it's not the most loving marriage, you could say. But they are going to actively work alongside each other. And Franklin owes a lot of his political success to Eleanor in many ways. But certainly they get married in 1905. Now, FDR certainly is going to overcome some hardships throughout his life. He is actually going to be struck with what is called polio. Now, at the time, polio didn't have a vaccine like it does today. And so there were ranging effects of how polio could affect you. And one of the ways that it can affect you is it can paralyze typically your legs. And so this was something that happens to FDR. And so he would be confined to a wheelchair for most of how he would get around. However, when he's president, he tries very hard to convey strength, and so he doesn't try to be publicly seen, if possible, in that wheelchair, which is sometimes why we don't remember him as being our first handicapped president, physically handicapped. And he decided not to let that get in the way, though, and he certainly refused to give in. And he definitely remained in politics despite his new ability. And Roosevelt's going to get elected governor of New York. And again, got a lot of thanks to Eleanor. She's also very politically astute. But he's going to get elected in 1928 as well as 1930. And he's going to definitely earn a reputation as a reformer, as somebody who is conveying change, which is going to be very attractive to Americans as we head into the election of 1932. Now, in my class, we're going to pause here for a moment. We're not going to do that right now, but I'm going to show students part of the inaugural address that FDR gives after he's first elected. And for those of you who are curious, I would highly recommend you check it out. But it's essentially where he gives that very important and famous line where the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So certainly, definitely worth checking out. And as president, FDR really takes on two essential tasks as he heads into the beginning of his presidency. One, with unemployment at nearly 25%, he's going to try to put people back to work. And again, like we talked about last time, that's an average for all Americans. That number gets much higher when we talk about African Americans, Native Americans, Latinx Americans, Asian Americans. The second thing that he's got to do is he's got to restore these failed banks. Not only does he have to get them back up and running, but he's got to restore people's faith in those banks. That's going to be huge for his presidency. And so Roosevelt's got this tall task. He's got to work with Congress. Now, fortunately for FDR, there are a lot of fairly radical Republicans and a lot of reformer Democrats that are already in. So a lot of like-minded people in both the House of Representatives and the Senate when FDR gets started. This is a big part of the reason why a lot of his early plans get approved so fast, is because there's a lot of like-minded people who are looking at this situation and like the ideas that FDR brings in. But this is a time period where he gets a lot of these things passed that becomes known as the first 100 days or the 100 days. And so one of the things you will commonly hear when people are running for president is they're going to talk about what they're going to do in their first 100 days. And this is often in reference to FDR, because FDR did a lot of things in those first 100 days. So presidents since him have talked about how they're going to use those first 100 days to make a change. And again, that's in reference to FDR. Again, I'm not going to do it right now, but FDR, he utilized the technology of the time period, and he knew that radio was important, and he knew that he could talk directly to the American people using the radio, much like presidents today utilize television in order to talk directly to the American people. But you're going to see with this that he would give a series of fireside chats. And essentially, this is where he would talk to the American people about what he and the government were trying to do to make some changes. And you'd have heard it across, a lot of the big stations like NBC, CBS, MBS, even the Blue Network too. And again, people are listening on the radio. He's trying to encourage them to restore some of that faith in banks and what he's trying to do to put people back to work. So let's talk a little bit about some of the actions that he does in just a second, but let's recap real quick. What was Roosevelt's primary task when he took office? And again, pause if you need to. Is it A, to win the war, B, to decrease states' rights, C, to expand the territory of the United States, or D, to decrease unemployment? Again, pause if you need to, but we'll keep moving. Best answer here is D. Again, trying to put people back to work and restore those failed banks. FDR is going to take much more of this, what we might call big government approach. He's going to try to actively use the government to put people back to work. And a lot of times it was for public works like what you see here in this picture, which is the building of the Hoover Dam. And again, using public funds, a lot of times taxes, in order to help create these public works. So we're going to be able to describe how Roosevelt's New Deal, this first 100 days, and the legislation that follows, how it affected many areas of American life. It's going to talk about, he's going to get involved with banking, the stock market and regulation of that, try to get industry rolling up again, trying to get agriculture restored, and even providing some welfare supports for people that need it. So these laws that are passed by Congress, again, during those first 100 days of the Roosevelt administration, become known as the New Deal. And I want to talk to you a little bit about some of these programs. And this is something, too, that historians often will call alphabet soup, because there's a lot of acronyms. And let's start with the first one. There's work relief programs, again, that gave government jobs to people who were in need. And one of those areas was the CCC, which is the Civilian Conservation Corps. This is basically a government program that is used to help create public works, things like dams, things like bridges, things like roads, but also certainly parks. And so certainly where this is being recorded in Minnesota, this is definitely a good example of a lot of our state parks being created and or expanded under the CCC. So certainly see examples of those from throughout the Great Depression. You also certainly have groups like the FERA, or the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. The goal of this particular government program was to provide direct support, usually financial support, to the poorest of the poor, and trying to help those people out with government assistance. Again, a little bit of that fall more into the welfare section of this. You also have the AAA, which is the Agricultural Adjustment Act. This was the idea of helping to ensure prices for farm goods and trying to help control production, essentially trying to more or less create more guaranteed income for farmers to help create stability, but also to help keep food prices lower. Because one of the things that unfortunately happens to food prices is they go way up during the Great Depression. And this is difficult because people can't afford it. So the AAA tried to change that. You also have the TVA, which is the Tennessee Valley Authority. This aimed at trying to control flooding, and they would create dams and dikes and other things in order to try to prevent flooding. It also promoted conservation, and also while generating electricity in rural areas, particularly in the South, of course, named, of course, for Tennessee. So just to kind of give you a general scope, so in the United States, certainly you're going to have Tennessee here, and again, the vast majority of the program takes place certainly in Tennessee, certainly very apt for the name, but you can see the areas in green are supplied with power from the TVA. You can see the red, those are the dams that get built, but you can also see them in Kentucky, Mississippi, Alabama, even a little bit into Georgia, and you're starting to even get into a little bit of North Carolina as well. So the idea here, again, that and the steam power plants, essentially providing much needed electricity in those rural areas, especially in, say, like the Smoky Mountains. Although certainly that's going to be a challenging area to get electricity to. Another one, certainly the NIR. This is the National Industrial Recovery Act. This was created to try to help bolster or boost the economy, in particular help businesses to regulate themselves and to try to generate more opportunity for growth for businesses so they could start hiring people back. Again, trying to address that unemployment rate. You also have the FDIC, and this one gets more into the banking. One of the reasons why people had removed money from the banks is they were afraid that the bank was going to lose their money and then they wouldn't have anything. So what the FDIC essentially does is it creates an insurance. It helps to insure bank deposits. So this is the one I always tell students, that this is the one that's going to probably have the biggest effect on you, because anytime you walk into a bank, a lot of times you're going to see these four letters, FDIC. Basically, this means that if you put your money in this bank, it is guaranteed by the federal government to be there regardless of what happens to the bank. So if the bank were to fail, or if the bank were to, give out bad loans and then eventually, not be able to recover, your money is insured. 100% up to $250,000, and then it partially, I think, depends on your individual situation. But again, up to $250,000 for sure will be backed up by this insurance. And again, that was done to promote and restore some of that faith that had been lost from the banks when they closed. You're also going to have the SEC. This is the Securities and Exchange Commission. This one's trying to regulate both the sale as well as the trade of stocks and bonds. essentially trying to prevent some of which had brought the stock market down. And so trying to, again, learn from that history and try to ensure that it was done more sustainably. And again, trying to prevent mistakes from the past. So you can kind of see, again, putting people back to work, regulating businesses, trying to promote businesses to bring people more back into work. And then again, things like the FDIC trying to restore people's faith in banks. Now, the New Deal isn't the cure. It's not what's going to ultimately pull the nation out of its ills. It's not going to make everything better. However, this flurry of activity does restore some confidence to Americans. And confidence and hope were two things that, especially as the Great Depression started, were really lacking in the United States. And so, while they don't ultimately end the Great Depression, they do help Americans to kind of dig deep and to find hope as they get into the heart of the Great Depression. So here's where we're, again, if you need to pause, but here we're going to check in for understanding again. What program under the New Deal, so from the things that we talked about, what created hydroelectric plants that provided cheap electricity to thousands of farms and homes in some southern states? Is that the Public Works Administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the National Recovery Administration, or the Agricultural Adjustment Act? Again, pause if you need to, but the best answer here is TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Again, you're going to find it in those southern states that provided electricity. You're going to see dams built, steam power also being there. Certainly also encourage you here at the end to just do a little bit more review. And for my students, again, I highly recommend you do this just to kind of make sure that you're kind of keeping up and that you're keeping especially the alphabet soup straight, although we'll keep working with this. So again, if you've got any questions, let me know. And I want to thank you all for listening. And we'll see you on another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History. Thanks for listening.